What do you see when you look at a king? Do you see power, divine right, a figure of immense strength, born to rule worlds, now? Look closer. Peel back the velvet, the ermine, the jewel-encrusted crown. Look past the gilded throne and the cavernous halls of the palace. Look at the man. Imagine a king who could barely speak, his tongue so large it seemed to fill his mouth, turning every royal decree into a garbled mumble. Imagine a monarch who struggled to chew his teeth so mismatched that the top row couldn't meet the bottom, making every meal a silent, agonizing ordeal. Imagine an heir to a global empire, the ruler of half the known world, who could not walk properly until he was nearly 8 years old, his legs as weak as his tormented mind. This wasn't a figure from a fairy tale nightmare. He was real. He was King Charles II of Spain, ruler of the Spanish Empire at its zenith, an empire on which the sun never set. But on its king, the sun seemed to have never truly risen. His subjects didn't see him as a symbol of power. They saw him as a living curse. They called him El Hechizado, the Bewitched. They whispered that a demon resided within his frail body, that a witch's hex had corrupted his blood from birth. Priests were summoned not to advise but to exorcise. They performed holy rites over his convulsing form, chanting prayers to cast out the evil they believed was rotting the kingdom from the throne outwards. The greatest minds of the church and state stared at their sovereign, a man plagued by seizures, fevers, and weeping sores, and could only conclude that this was the work of Satan. But the truth was far more terrifying than any demon. The monster that haunted Charles II wasn't from hell. It came from his own family. The curse wasn't spoken in a dark incantation. It was written down meticulously over centuries in the royal marriage contracts. The poison that withered his body and mind wasn't brewed in a cauldron. It was flowing in his very veins. The story of the Bewitched King is not a tale of black magic. It is the story of the most powerful family in the world, a family so obsessed with preserving its power that it committed a slow, agonizing biological suicide. This is the story of the Habsburgs and the price they paid for purity. Why? That is the question that hangs over this entire tragedy like a funeral shroud. Why would the House of Habsburg, the most dominant political force in Europe for over 3 centuries, engage in a systematic breeding program that would ultimately lead to its own extinction? This wasn't an accident. It wasn't an isolated case of a misguided royal falling for a close relative. This was policy. A cold, calculated dynastic strategy pursued with relentless determination, generation after generation. For over 200 years, the Spanish Habsburgs turned their family tree into a tangled, suffocating wreath. Of the 11 marriages that occurred within the Spanish line leading to Charles II, 9 were consanguineous. They were between close blood relatives. First cousins married first cousins. Uncles married their nieces. This was the norm, not the exception. The family became a closed loop, a genetic echo chamber, where the same blood was passed back and forth, concentrating not just its power, but its flaws. The motivation on the surface was brutally simple power. The Habsburg motto was, Bella gerant ali tu felix Austria nubes. Let others wage war. You happy Austria marry. Marriage was their weapon of choice, their primary tool of statecraft. Through a series of brilliant and strategic unions, they had amassed an inheritance unlike any other Spain and its vast American empire, the Netherlands, parts of Italy, Austria, Bohemia, Hungary. Their dominion was a patchwork of crowns, titles, and territories stitched together by wedding vows. To lose a single piece of this inheritance was unthinkable. If a Habsburg princess married an outsider, a French prince, an English duke, her dowry could include a province, a kingdom. That territory would be lost to the family forever. The solution seemed obvious to them: keep it all in the family. Marry Habsburg to Habsburg, consolidate the titles, hoard the land, and ensure that the bloodline, this supposedly sacred, divinely appointed blood, remained pure and undiluted by foreign influence. They were creating a dynasty so exclusive, so powerful, that it answered to no one but God. But here lies the terrible paradox, the central conflict of our story. In their quest to build an unbreakable house of power, they violated a fundamental law of nature, a law that was understood intuitively long before the science of genetics existed. Farmers knew not to breed their best livestock too closely, lest the offspring be born weak or deformed. The Catholic Church, which held immense sway over their world, technically forbade marriage between close kin, forcing the Habsburgs to spend fortunes lobbying popes for special dispensations, arguing that the political stability of Christendom depended on these unions. They got their permissions. They preserved their lands. They maintained their pure bloodline. But what was the cost they were paying for their empire with the health of their children? The infant and child mortality rate for the Spanish Habsburgs was staggering. Out of 34 children born in the direct Spanish line, half of them died before the age of 10. This was double the rate of peasant families of the time who lived in squalor and had no access to royal physicians. The richest, most protected family on earth couldn't keep their children alive. So the question becomes darker, more complex. It's not just, why did they do it? It is, did they know? Did they see the pattern when Philip IV looked at his sickly heir, Charles? Did he see the face of his own sister, Charles's mother? Did he see the culmination of generations of this gilded curse? Or was the lure of power so blinding, the belief in their own exceptionalism so absolute, that they simply couldn't see the abyss they were breeding themselves into? This is a story about the collision between human ambition at its most grandiose and biological reality at its most unforgiving. To understand the tragedy of Charles II, we must walk through the gilded, suffocating halls of his world. We must step back into the court of the Spanish Habsburgs, a world of rigid formality, stifling piety, and unimaginable wealth, all built around a crumbling, genetic core. Our story begins not with Charles, but with the architects of his fate. Let us picture his parents. The father, King Philip IV of Spain. A man already a product of inbreeding, his own parents being first cousins. By the time he was in his 40s, he was a widower, and his only son and heir had died. The future of the Spanish Empire rested on him producing another male heir. The choice of a new wife was the most important political decision in the world. And who did he choose? The House of Habsburg, of course. He chose his own niece, Mariana of Austria. She was just 14 years old. He was 44. She had been betrothed to her cousin, the dead heir. Now she would marry her uncle instead. The family loop had to be closed. Imagine being that girl, Mariana. Sent to a foreign court, married to a man 30 years her senior, who was also her mother's brother. Her duty was singular and crushing: produce a healthy son. She gave birth to several children. Most were stillborn or died within weeks, or faded away in early childhood. Each tiny coffin that left the palace was a fresh wound to the dynasty. The pressure mounted. The court whispered. The kingdom held its breath. And then in 1661 a son was born who survived. They named him Charles. From the moment he drew his first breath, the fate of a global empire was placed upon his tiny, fragile shoulders. The relief at his survival was quickly replaced by a creeping, unspoken horror. The child was not well. The Habsburg legacy, visible for generations as a pronounced lower jaw, had reached a grotesque extreme in Charles. His jaw was so large and protruding that he could not close his mouth. He drooled constantly. His tongue, swollen and clumsy, made suckling as an infant a life-threatening challenge. He was a weak, sick baby beset by constant fevers and illnesses. While other royal children of Europe were being taught to ride, to fence, to study languages and military strategy, Charles was kept in a state of extended infancy. He was treated like a holy relic, too fragile to touch, too precious to educate. He wasn't weaned from a wet nurse until he was 5 or 6 years old, largely because he was physically unable to chew food. He did not learn to speak until he was 4. He couldn't walk until he was 8. His tutors reported that he was passive, apathetic, and seemed incapable of grasping even the simplest concepts. Was it a lack of intellect, or was he simply trapped inside a body that refused to obey him, a body that caused him constant chronic pain? Imagine the silence in the grand rooms of the Alcazar Palace in Madrid, a sprawling fortress of art, power, and history, and at its center, a silent, stumbling child king. When his father, Philip IV, died, Charles was just 4 years old. He was now Charles II, King of Spain, Naples, Sicily, and Lord of the Indies, a title that was a cruel joke. He sat through council meetings a bewildered ghost at the head of the table, as his mother Mariana ruled as regent. She was a fierce protector of her son and his inheritance. But her protection smothered him. Desperate to shield him from the world she indulged, his every whim demanded nothing of him and kept him isolated. The court around him became a viper's nest of factions, each vying for influence over the weak-minded king. Power in Spain no longer resided in the monarch, but in who could control him. As he grew into a teenager, his condition did not improve. He was tall but spindly and uncoordinated, with a large, lolling head that seemed too heavy for his thin neck. His public appearances were a source of national anxiety. The people of Spain, who believed their king was God's chosen representative on earth, saw a shuffling, vacant-eyed creature who embodied not divine favor but divine wrath. The whispers of witchcraft and curses grew louder. It was easier to believe in devils than to accept that the most noble bloodline in Christendom was inherently rotten. Now place yourself in his shoes. Imagine you are Charles. You live in a palace where every surface gleams with gold, but you cannot eat a simple meal without pain. You are dressed in the finest silks, but your legs tremble beneath you. Servants bow to you, ministers address you as Your Majesty, but you struggle to form a coherent sentence in response. You know you are the king, the center of this universe, but you feel like an imposter, a broken puppet. You are surrounded by people, yet you are profoundly, terrifyingly alone. Plagued by melancholy, punctuated by fits of rage, your life is a confusing fog of discomfort and expectation. What would that do to your soul? How would you perceive the world? The most pressing duty of any king was to produce an heir. The survival of the dynasty depended on it. At age 18, a match was made for Charles. The bride was the vibrant, beautiful French princess, Marie-Louise d'Orléans. She arrived at the Spanish court full of life, a stark contrast to the morbid gloom of the palace and its king. The court hoped she would invigorate him, that her vitality could somehow overcome his frailty. The marriage was a personal and political disaster. It is reported that Charles was deeply devoted to his wife in his own way, but he was by all credible accounts impotent. The specifics are lost to history and modesty, but the result was clear: the royal bed was barren. Marie-Louise, trapped in the rigid Spanish court, grew depressed and lonely. After 10 years of a childless marriage, she died suddenly, perhaps of appendicitis, though rumors of poison, as always, swirled through the court. Charles was inconsolable. His grief was profound, one of the few powerful emotions he seemed capable of expressing clearly. But the state could not wait for a king to mourn. An heir was a matter of European security. A new wife was found, Maria Anna of Neuburg, a German princess known for her strong family and reputed fertility. The dynasty's hopes were pinned on her, but the second marriage was no more successful than the first. Years passed. No children came. It was during this time that the theory of demonic possession took firm hold. The queen, desperate and ambitious, encouraged the narrative. If the king was bewitched, then his impotence wasn't his fault. It was a spiritual affliction, and it could be cured. Thus began the darkest chapter of Charles's life. He was subjected to humiliating and terrifying public exorcisms. He was forced to sleep with relics of saints. He was made to gaze upon the exhumed, rotting corpses of his Habsburg ancestors in the morbid hope that their proximity would somehow shock his body into functioning. Imagine this scene, the King of Spain, frail and trembling, being led deep into the royal crypt under the El Escorial Palace. By torchlight, the tombs of his father, his grandfather, his great-grandfather are opened. The stench of decay fills the air. He is forced to look at the skeletal remains of the very people whose choices sealed his fate, and he is told that this is his path to salvation. This was not medicine. This was not statecraft. This was madness. A dynasty staring its own reflection in the face of death and seeing only superstition. The end came in the year 1700. Charles was only 38 years old, but he looked like a decrepit old man. His body finally gave out. His final days were filled with agony. The official autopsy performed by his physician is one of the most chilling documents in medical history. Dr. Pedro Rioja wrote that the king's body did not contain a single drop of blood. His heart was the size of a peppercorn, his lungs corroded, his intestines rotten and gangrenous. He had a single testicle black as coal, and his head was full of water. He was a biological wreck, a man whose system had completely collapsed. With his death, the Spanish line of the House of Habsburg was extinguished. He died without an heir, just as his family had feared for centuries. His will named a French prince, the grandson of his half-sister, as his successor. The very outcome the Habsburgs had practiced generations of incest to avoid the loss of their throne to a foreign power had come to pass. And it came to pass because of their methods. Their obsession with keeping power within the family had led directly to the family's end. The War of the Spanish Succession, a devastating conflict that engulfed Europe for over a decade, was the immediate result. Now I want you to pause and think. Imagine you are one of the Spanish nobles standing by as the king's will is read. For your entire life you have been taught that Habsburg blood is sacred, that the continuity of this one family is the foundation of your world. And now it is over. The last of his line is dead, a childless, broken man. A war is coming. The world you knew is about to be torn apart. Was it all for nothing? The wealth, the power, the purity of blood? What was it all worth when this is the result? The silence in that room must have been deafening, filled with the ghosts of all the choices that led to that single catastrophic moment of failure. What would you have thought? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. For centuries, the fate of Charles II was explained by curses and divine retribution. But today, we can pull back the veil of superstition and look at the evidence with the cold, clear eyes of modern science. The ghost that haunted the House of Habsburg was not supernatural, it was genetic. And we can map its path of destruction through their family tree. To understand what happened, we need a brief lesson in basic genetics. Every one of us inherits 2 copies or alleles of almost every gene, one from our mother, one from our father. Some alleles are dominant, meaning you only need 1 copy for the trait to appear. Others are recessive. A recessive allele is like a secret. You can carry 1 copy of it your entire life and never know it's there because its effect is masked by your other dominant allele. For a recessive trait to show itself, you must inherit 2 copies of it, one from each parent. Now, many of the most dangerous genetic diseases and mutations are recessive. In the vast ocean of the human gene pool, these harmful recessive alleles are relatively rare. The mathematical probability of 2 complete strangers meeting and having a child, who both happen to carry the exact same harmful recessive allele and both pass it on to that child, is extremely low. The genetic diversity of the general population acts as a buffer, keeping these hidden secrets safely locked away. But the Habsburgs didn't draw from the vast ocean. They drew from a small, stagnant pond. This is the science of inbreeding. When close relatives like an uncle and a niece or 2 first cousins have children, they are drawing from a much smaller shared gene pool. They both inherited their genes from the same recent ancestors. Therefore, the probability that they both carry the same hidden harmful recessive alleles is dramatically higher. And the probability that their child will inherit that same faulty allele from both of them skyrockets. Scientists have a term for this homozygosity. It means having 2 identical copies of a particular gene. While it can be harmless, forced homozygosity through inbreeding systematically unmasks all the dangerous recessive traits that have been lurking in a family's lineage. The hidden secrets are no longer secret. They become the child's reality. The genetic buffer is gone. We can actually quantify this. Geneticists use a measure called the inbreeding coefficient, represented by the letter F. This coefficient calculates the probability that an individual has inherited 2 identical alleles for any given gene because they came from a common ancestor. For the child of 2 unrelated people, F is essentially 0. For the child of a first cousin marriage, F is 0.0625 or 6.25%. For the child of an uncle-niece union, F is 0.125 or 12.5%. For the child of a brother-sister or parent-child union, F is 0.25 or 25%. A quarter of their genes are expected to be homozygous by descent. In 2009, a team of Spanish scientists did something remarkable. They studied the genealogy of the Spanish Habsburgs over 16 generations, tracing every marriage and every child. They built a complete family tree and then calculated the inbreeding coefficient for each individual. The results were shocking even for historians who knew the story well. King Philip IV. Charles's father had an inbreeding coefficient of 0.083, high. Queen Mariana, Charles's mother, and Philip's niece had an F value of 0.076, but when they had a child, their already concentrated genes combined. The inbreeding coefficient of their son, King Charles II, was a staggering 0.254. Let that number sink in. 0.254. That is statistically indistinguishable from the 0.25 value of a child born to a full sibling or a parent and child. Genetically speaking, Charles II was the equivalent of the son of his own brother or father. He was the endpoint of 2 centuries of relentless inbreeding, a perfect storm of genetic misfortune. The study found a direct statistical correlation. The higher a Habsburg royal's inbreeding coefficient, the higher their mortality rate. Charles was simply the most extreme example. With this genetic key, we can unlock the mysteries of his ailments. The famous Habsburg jaw, or mandibular prognathism, is a polygenic trait, meaning it's influenced by multiple genes. The intense inbreeding likely caused a homozygous overload of all the alleles responsible for it, taking a family trait and exaggerating it into a clinical deformity. His presumed impotence and infertility are classic symptoms of what scientists call inbreeding depression, a reduction in biological fitness in a given population as a result of inbreeding. But the 2009 study suggested something even more specific. They theorized that Charles suffered from 2 distinct genetic disorders caused by this homozygosity. The first was combined pituitary hormone deficiency, which would explain his short stature, weak muscles, and likely his infertility. The second was distal renal tubular acidosis, a kidney disorder that can lead to metabolic problems, weakness, and vomiting, all symptoms documented in his life. He wasn't bewitched. He wasn't cursed. He was a case study, a living, breathing, suffering illustration of a fundamental biological principle. The Habsburgs thought they were perfecting their bloodline, purifying it. From a genetic perspective, they were doing the exact opposite. They were systematically eliminating diversity, cornering their own DNA, and forcing every latent flaw out into the open. The autopsy that found a withered heart, corroded lungs, and a head full of water was not describing the work of a demon. It was describing the final catastrophic system failure of a body that was from its very conception genetically compromised beyond repair. So the science is clear. The history is written. But the story of the Habsburgs forces us to ask deeper, more uncomfortable questions. Questions about the very nature of power legacy and the recurring human obsession with purity. The Habsburgs were chasing an ideal sangre azul, blue blood. The belief that their blood was inherently different, more noble, more worthy than that of commoners or even other aristocrats. They weren't just protecting land. They were protecting what they saw as a sacred substance. This marriage strategy was in a way a religious act, an attempt to keep their divine mandate undiluted, to create a dynasty of human thoroughbreds destined to rule. And in this, they were not alone. This quest for purity is a dark, seductive thread that runs through all of human history. It is a siren song that has led nations and ideologies to ruin. Look at the caste systems of the world, which for centuries have enforced strict endogamy forbidding marriage outside one's social stratum to maintain a rigid, pure, social and spiritual order. The consequences are often the same: social stagnation, and in some isolated groups, the proliferation of genetic disease. Look at the racist ideologies of the 20th century, most horrifically embodied by the Third Reich's obsession with the Aryan master race. This was the Habsburg ideal twisted into a genocidal political program. The goal was to purify the nation by eliminating those deemed impure and promoting breeding among the racially valuable. It was a national project of eugenics, a belief that humanity could be perfected by controlling its bloodlines. The irony, the universe's cruel joke, is that nature despises this kind of purity. Biology does not reward it. Evolution thrives on diversity, on the mixing and mingling of genes. Genetic diversity is a defense mechanism. It creates a robust, adaptable population capable of surviving new diseases and changing environments. A genetically pure population, like the Habsburgs, is brittle. It is a monoculture vulnerable to a single point of failure. A single lurking recessive gene can become a dynastic death sentence. The Habsburgs proved this in the most spectacular way imaginable. Their quest for a superior bloodline created a legacy of infirmity, sterility, and suffering. Their attempt to create a race of super kings produced Charles II, a man who was the antithesis of everything they valued. They sought strength and found weakness. They sought eternal power and found extinction. Their story is the ultimate testament to the concept of hubris, the dangerous pride that pits human ambition against the fundamental laws of the cosmos. They flew too close to the sun, not with wings of wax and feathers, but with a family tree woven from vanity and power. This forces us to reevaluate what a strong lineage even means. Is it one that is exclusive, guarded, and insular? Or is it one that is open, adaptive, and diverse? The Habsburgs built walls around their gene pool, and in doing so they created a prison for their descendants. And so we must ask ourselves, do we still chase these phantoms of purity today? Perhaps not through royal incest, but think about our modern world. Think about the way we build communities. Do we seek out diversity, or do we retreat into echo chambers online? We curate our feeds to show us only what we already believe. We join groups of people who look, think, and vote exactly as we do. We create ideological inbreeding, where a lack of new ideas leads to extremist, brittle, and fragile worldviews incapable of compromise or adaptation. Think about our social structures. The obsession with elite schools, exclusive neighborhoods, and legacy admissions. The unspoken pressure in some circles to marry within one's own socio-economic class. Is this not a modern, sanitized version of the same impulse? An attempt to hoard opportunity, to consolidate advantage, and to create a pure lineage of status and wealth. We may not be passing down the Habsburg jaw, but perhaps we are passing down a more subtle deformity, a lack of empathy, an inability to understand lives different from our own, a dangerous sense of entitlement. The Habsburg story is a warning. It demonstrates that any system, whether it is biological, social, or ideological, that closes itself off and obsesses over its own purity, is doomed to decay. Strength comes from connection, resilience comes from diversity, and wisdom comes from humility. The Habsburgs had none of the above, and they paid the ultimate price. It is easy to look back at the Habsburgs from our 21st century vantage point and see them as figures from a distant, almost alien world. A world of divine right, courtly intrigue, and arranged marriages that seems to have no bearing on our own lives. We have science. We have genetic counseling. We understand the dangers they so blindly courted. But are we truly so different? Have the underlying instincts that drove them really disappeared? Or have they just mutated into more modern forms? The most direct legacy of this story is, of course, in the realm of genetics. The practice of royal intermarriage has, for the most part, vanished. When a future king like Prince William marries a commoner like Kate Middleton, it's not just a romantic story. It's a symbol of a monumental shift. It's a tacit acknowledgement that the health and vitality of a lineage are more important than the arcane concept of pure blood. Modern royalty survives by embracing the diversity their ancestors shunned. However, the biological problem of inbreeding has not been eradicated. It has simply shifted from the palaces of kings to the pockets of isolated communities around the world. These are often not driven by a lust for power, but by geography, religion, or a deep-seated desire to preserve cultural identity. Think of the old order Amish in the United States. Their closed community, descended from a small number of founding immigrants, has led to a founder effect, where rare genetic traits become magnified. This has resulted in a higher prevalence of specific conditions like Ellis Van Creveld syndrome, a form of dwarfism, or certain metabolic disorders. They grapple with this reality, balancing their deeply held faith with the challenges of modern medicine. Think of certain isolated villages in the mountains of Sardinia or the deserts of the Middle East. For centuries, geography made it difficult to marry outside the community. The result is a unique genetic landscape, a treasure trove for scientists studying inherited disease, but a painful reality for the families living it. In these cases, inbreeding is not a strategy, but a byproduct of circumstance and tradition. The lesson of the Habsburgs echoes in these communities. A closed system, no matter how pure its intentions, will always face a biological reckoning. But let's move beyond the purely genetic. Let's talk about the inbreeding of power and wealth. The Habsburgs used marriage to consolidate kingdoms. Today, the ultra-elite use different mechanisms to achieve a similar end, the consolidation of opportunity and influence. Consider the world of legacy admissions at elite universities, where the children of alumni are given a significant advantage. Consider the networks of exclusive boarding schools, Ivy League universities, and Wall Street firms, where social circles are tight and opportunities are often passed between friends and family. This creates a feedback loop. Wealth and power become concentrated in a smaller and smaller group of people who go to the same schools, work at the same companies, sit on the same boards, and yes, often marry each other. This is not genetic inbreeding, but it is a form of social inbreeding. And it has its own version of the Habsburg jaw. It can create a ruling class that is dangerously out of touch with the realities of the society it governs. A class of people who, despite their intelligence and education, may lack the diversity of experience necessary to make wise decisions for the whole of the population. Like Charles II, they can become trapped in the gilded cage of their own privilege, their worldview deformed by a lack of exposure to different perspectives. They may struggle to understand the language of the common person, not because of a physical ailment, but because of a chasm of experience. This social insularity can lead to brittle political systems, tone-deaf economic policies, and a society that feels increasingly divided and resentful. Think also of ideological inbreeding. In the age of the internet algorithm, we are all at risk of creating our own tiny Habsburg courts. Our social media feeds become echo chambers curated to show us opinions that reinforce our own. We block, mute, and unfriend those who disagree with us. We create pure ideological bloodlines untainted by dissenting views. The result is not strength, but fragility. Our beliefs become extreme and uncompromising. We lose the ability to debate, to empathize, to see nuance. We become, in a sense, intellectually homozygous, our minds populated only by identical copies of the same ideas. This leads to the polarization and political dysfunction that plague so many nations today. We are so convinced of our own purity that we'd rather see the entire system collapse than marry our ideas to those of the other. The story of Charles II is therefore not just a historical curiosity. It is a parable about the dangers of turning inward. Whether it's a family turning in on its own genes, a social class turning in on its own privilege, or an individual turning in on their own beliefs, the result is the same weakness, fragility, and an eventual, inevitable decline. The Habsburgs built an empire of gold and land, but they forgot that the most valuable resource of any system is the diversity that flows into it. They locked the gates to keep their power safe, and in doing so they starved their own lineage to death. The question for us in our own modern world is, what gates are we locking and what are we starving in the process? In the end, the story of Charles II of Spain is one of profound, almost Shakespearean tragedy. He was born a king, but lived as a prisoner of his own body, a prisoner of his court's suffocating rituals, and most of all, a prisoner of his ancestry. He was the final agonizing note in a dynastic symphony that had been playing for centuries. He wasn't a monster to be feared or a curse to be lifted. He was a victim, the last sad product of a family that valued power above all else, above reason, above compassion, and ultimately above its own survival. The Spanish Habsburg Empire, a global superpower that had dominated the world stage, did not fall to a foreign invader or a popular revolution. It rotted from the head down. It collapsed inward, undone by a quiet biological truth. A truth that had been whispered in the cries of dying infants and ignored in the halls of power for generations. The story is a lesson written in the language of genetics and carved into the stone of history of what happens when the pursuit of an artificial purity leads to genuine decay. The Habsburgs are a ghost, now a chapter in a history book. But the temptations that drove them are immortal. The desire to protect what is ours, the fear of the other, the belief that our own group, our own blood, our own ideas are superior. These impulses did not die with Charles II. They are alive and well in our world, wearing modern clothes and speaking a modern language. The tale of El Hechizado is a mirror. It forces us to look at our own systems, our own societies, and our own hearts, and to ask, where are we creating our own closed loops? Where are we sacrificing long-term health for short-term purity? Where is our ambition blinding us to the fundamental truths of nature and humanity? The answers to those questions are what will determine whether our own legacies thrive, or whether they too will become a dark history, a cautionary tale for future generations to ponder. The past is never truly past. It just waits for us to listen. The story of the Habsburgs is one of history's most stark and tragic warnings. But countless other stories lie buried holding lessons we have yet to learn. What corner of dark history do you believe holds a critical message for our world today? Share your thoughts and suggestions in the comments below. I read every one of them, and if you believe that understanding the shadows of our past is crucial to navigating the present, please consider subscribing to Dark History and enabling notifications. There are so many more stories to tell.